After studying this module, you shall be able to know the history, relevance, and applications of social cognitive theory, identify how social cognitive theory is different from other personality theories, understand some of the social factors that determine how we learn, and lastly, evaluate the impact of social cognitive theory in the development of human personality. From the beginning of human civilizations, researchers of diverse fields were intrigued about the human nature and how it develops. These inquiries triggered a series of research in the area of philosophy, psychology, and education. Also, soon followed was a paradigm shift in terms of what was being studied and how. Earlier theories relied heavily on principles of behaviorism, whereas the latter ones shifted to the focus to also include cognitive processes and their role in human learning and development. All the theories proposed in this direction can be broadly clubbed under three categories. First, developmental, second, environmental, and third, crossover. Though there is a variation in what the theorists have proposed in each of these categories, there are a few underpinnings which help in classifying them under one umbrella. We'll very briefly look into the basic tenets of theories to understand and identify the differences between them. The first is development theories. These are essentially based on cognitive processes and rarely, if ever, do they ever include introspective processes. The major proposition being that individuals' perception would change in accordance to each sequential developmental stage, and no individual can skip or escape these developmental changes. The second set of theories, which are environmental theories, were of the opinion that human behavior is completely conditioned and determined by external forces, including genetics and environmental factors. For them, idea of free will was an illusion. And lastly, the crossover theories posed questions regarding the role of consciousness in behavior and development. In addition to acknowledging the impact of external forces, crossover theorists also often included cognitive processes while analyzing behavioral choices. They proposed that humans play a more active role in learning and development than being controlled and determined essentially by external factors. Although all these theories contributed immensely, but Albert Bandura felt that none of the approaches could satisfactorily explain the complete process of understanding human behavior. Earlier in his career, he, along with his colleagues and students, designed studies to examine social explanations to understand the reasons behind children's aggressive behavior. The result of the studies gave an insight to the value of modeling for learning new behavior and also suggested a difference between learning and performance. Findings of the research contradicted the assumptions of behavioristic theories of learning by trial and error, or that the changes in human behavior are due to consequences of one's own actions alone. These studies also helped Bandura in proposing his theory, which was initially known as observational learning theory and then later renamed as social learning theory. Bandura's research prior to social cognitive theory helped in establishing the model to suggest how people learn through observations as well. All the research Bandura and his team carried out helped him inch towards the formulation of a more comprehensive theory of understanding human behavior. Social cognitive theory also borrowed ideas from information processing models of psychological functioning to describe the various cognitive processes that facilitate learning. Ultimately, Bandura noted in the preface to his 1986 treatise, Social Foundations of Thought and Action, a social cognitive theory, that in an effort to be inclusive of these more motivational and cognitive processes, he was using the label social cognitive theory rather than social learning to describe his framework. Since that time, social cognitive theory has continued to grow and expand, especially with regard to the work on self-efficacy, self-regulation, and agency. There are a few basic assumptions of social cognitive theory. Let's look at each one of them one by one. Social cognitive theory rests on three basic assumptions about learning and behavior. The first assumption is about triadic reciprocity. This assumption suggests that personal, behavioral, and environmental factors influence each other in a bidirectional and reciprocal manner. In other words, how an individual functions is a result of ongoing interaction between cognitive, behavioral, and contextual factors. The second assumption implies that people have an agency or ability to influence their behavior and the environment in a purposeful, goal-directed fashion. This belief conflicts with earlier forms of behaviorism that advocated a more rigorous form of environmental determinism. Though this theory does not underplay the significance of the environment in determining behavior, but it does posit that people can also exercise substantial influence over their own outcomes and the environment more broadly with the help of foresight, self-reflection, and self-regulatory processes. The third assumption within the theory is that learning can take place with or without an immediate recognizable change in behavior. In other words, learning and the demonstration of what has been learned are two different processes. One reason for this distinction is that the theory also assumes that learning involves not just the acquisition of new behavior, but also knowledge, cognitive skills, concepts, abstract rules, values, and other cognitive constructs. This division of learning and behavior is a shift from the position advocated by behavioral theories that define learning stridently as a change in the form of frequency of behavior. It also means that students can learn but not demonstrate that learning until motivated to do so through foresight, self-reflection, and self-regulatory processes. Before studying more about the theory, let's briefly look at the biographical sketch of Albert Bandura. Bandura's theory of human development is very, very crucial, but his brief history also gives us an idea about how he came upon it. He was born in 1925, he was the youngest of 6 children and grew up in a small town in Canada. His basic school and high school years were spent at the only school in his small town. Due to paucity of resources, students had to often work, taking up their own initiative. Bandura's parents had a huge role to play in encouraging young Bandura to seek out possibilities despite their humble origins. His initiation in psychology was also a chance happening. He took up the course of psychology during graduation to keep himself busy in mornings and soon became captivated by the subject. He graduated in 1949 from University of British Columbia, earning an award in psychology. He went on to do his master's in 1951 and subsequently a PhD from University of Iowa, which in those times was considered to be the hub of theoretical psychology. He joined teaching in University of Stanford in 1953 and continued to teach and research there. He went on to become the president of the prestigious American Psychological Association in 1974 and Western Psychological Association in 1981. Besides a great recognition he garnered for his exemplary work in the area of human learning and development, he was also awarded with several prestigious awards and distinctions. He says, and I quote, "As I reflect on my journey to this octogenarian milepost, I am reminded of the saying that it is not the miles traveled, but the amount of tread remaining that is important. When I last checked, I still have too much tread left to gear down or to conclude this engaging odyssey." After learning about the biography of Albert Bandura, let's now look at the 4 cornerstones of social cognitive theory. There are 4 cornerstones of social cognitive theory. The first 2 are human agency and human capabilities. They can be seen as the basis of the development of social learning. The next element is known as vicarious learning. It assesses a process through which observational learning takes place. And the final element is called self-efficacy, which determines the depiction of learned behavior. Let's first look at human agency. Social cognitive theory is embedded in the concept of human agency, which proposes that individuals are proactively engaged in their own development and are adept at exercising control over their feelings, thoughts, and actions. According to Bandura, agency operates through 3 modes: individual agency, collective agency, and proxy agency. Individual agency is applied when one uses his or her own influence to function in his or her own respective environment. Collective agency is when they work together to advance common interest. And proxy agency is what helps people to reach their goal with the help of someone else. Agency manifests its over 4 main properties. The first one being intentionality, which refers to the process of ideation and engagement by people which help them realize their predetermined plans. Second is forethought. It is another characteristic that allows individual to preempt the end result of their action. The third one is self-reactiveness, which allows us to prepare and plan and also manage the process of handling an action around them. And the last one, self-reflectiveness. It helps people dwell upon their capabilities, their accuracy of their thoughts and actions, and the resultant significance of their quest. The second cornerstone is human capabilities. There are 4 types of human capabilities, which, alike properties of agency, enable cognitive measures, which allows people to evaluate a scenario and respond to it appropriately. Capabilities are symbolization, forethought, self-regulation, and self-reflection. They all provide a definitive course for us as individuals to make modification in responses and thereby self-development. The first capacity of human beings is the art of symbolize, through which they decipher meanings from their immediate surroundings, create references of future actions, gain knowledge by reflective thought, communicate with others over distance in time and space, and most importantly, store information. Symbolization allows people to engage in forethought, enabling them to plan their action and anticipate consequences. Bandura proposed that people self-reflect metacognitively to examine their own functioning, which allows them to make sense of experiences, self-evaluate, and judge their capability to accomplish tasks. Further, this self-reflection is motivated by both the long and short-term goals and challenges that people set. The 2 types of goals work in tandem. Short-term goals provide motivation to take the necessary measure, which over a period of time leads to the realization of long-term goals. Through self-regulation, people can fine-tune their behavior to both plan and achieve their short and long-term goals. The second one is vicarious learning. As one would notice, people learn from behavior of others around them. It allows them to develop sense to prescribe their behavior in similar scenario. One imbibes such behaviors by a process of attention, retention, production, and motivation. Social cognitive theory's hallmark is its articulation of the functions and processes of vicarious learning. Attention implies that individual observes discretely or otherwise behavior of a model. The model being observed will invariably influence the observer with its native characteristics such as complexity, attractiveness, and similarity. Observers' cognitive capabilities will determine how a behavior has been imbibed and, more importantly, retained in one's memory. Retention in memory is driven by factors such as symbolic coding, cognitive organization, rehearsal, and cognitive skills, whereas process of production underlines translation of symbolic representation of observed behavior into an action for the individual. Representational guidance and corrective adjustment drives production of an observed behavior, which also is heavily dependent on individuals' capabilities and their skills. Lastly, it is motivation which plays a crucial role in the enactment of observed behavior, acting or reinforcement. Behavior enactment by an individual will lead to feedback, which may come from society around or internally. Feedback can also come in forms of outcome of enacting a behavior. Such feedback can be either positive or negative and will determine the level of reinforcement at an individual level. It also would reinforcement in how an individual feels in enactment of an observed behavior. Outcomes may be physical, social, self-evaluative in nature, and are usually associated with positive or negative valence. Fourth cornerstone is self-efficacy. Bandura said that a behavior would not be enacted unless an individual possesses the self-efficacy to do so. Learning through observing others need not ensure its enactment unless one possesses efficiency desired by the behavior observed. An individual's belief within to carry out an observed behavior forms the definition of self-efficacy. He argued, and I quote, "People's level of motivation, affective states, and actions are based more on what they believe than on what is objectively true." Unquote. It is a belief within which determines above all other factors an individual's zeal for accomplishment and resilience in face of adversity to pursue its path. Though self-efficacy is a determined process, its own level is affected by other factors such as regulation of motivations, one's thought processes, ambient environment, and other things. Self-efficacy beliefs are reflective of outcome expectancy, where someone with positive outlook about future anticipates success, and someone with grim outlook displays general lack of confidence in most of their actions. Having stated that the basics of self-efficacy above, it also holds true that it is a process which can develop with time. Success begets self-efficacy is simplest example. Bandura identified four main sources of self-efficacy. As an extension to the last example, if success appears too easily and frequently, it affects one's self-efficacy at handling a sudden failure. Self-efficacy receives boost in observing a successful model that is similar to one's own self. Closer the association with such a model, stronger is the boost to self-efficacy. Thirdly, nothing works like a pat on the back to enhance self-efficacy. Encourage when people around makes us for a great enhancer to self-efficacy. When someone else displays behavior of placing faith in an individual, it adds to one's own belief. Lastly, one's judgment about your own self, bodily and mentally, will affect their belief in self-efficacy. An individual who's tired will have an impact on self-efficacy and thereby his actions. These are some of the things, if you pay attention to it closely, you can also use it in your own life, and you will see it will create a lot of positive associations with people around you whom you otherwise found to not be able to negotiate with. Now let's look at what are the various contributions of the social cognitive theory in understanding personality. The theory plays an important role in human development. This theory, proposed by Bandura, elaborates it through the following factors. The first one being dynamic approach. This factor propagates that an individual is not an autonomous logical entity affected only by an immediate environment. The dynamic approach says there is an interrelationship between personal factor and external factor. This theory is established on dynamic environment around individual and rational impact of the environment. Second factor is applicability. His proposition of concepts such as self-efficacy, observational learning, and reciprocal determinism have instant application in the real world. For example, when a counselor is helping a client to overcome a negative habit, the concept of self-efficacy shows a path for how can they evaluate and reform the same. The third factor is generalizability. Since social cognitive theory lays importance on how observation and environment play a role in learning behavior, it makes it easier to carry out cultural analysis. The theory does not take a moral high ground and make any judgments about human behavior. Instead, it looks at the process of how these behavior and moral codes are learned, and also postulates a structure to understand how some behavior can be more easily accommodated than in some other situation or cultures. The fourth factor is multidisciplinary application. The theory seems to find favors with diverse disciplines. It can find its application in the areas of education, psychology, anthropology, sociology, management, and journalism, to name a few. It also aids understanding of complex concepts for the people working in the area of clinical psychology, social work, occupational therapy, and many others. The other factor is evolving theory. One of the best features of the theory is that ever since its inception in 1962, it has been constantly evolving and reinventing itself. Very few theorists and theories can make such a tall claim. This dynamism sets it apart from many of its contemporary theories. Besides the points which we have discussed so far, there are two major contributions of social cognitive theory which has much significance in contemporary times. First, its role with respect to media, and the second is on education. We need to look into these two aspects a little more closely. Let's first understand the social cognitive theory and its impact on the media. This theory is well referenced under researches on the effects of media. It explains the influences and behavioral changes it brings about in people depending on the exposure they have to media. The ability to humans to think abstractly or symbolically positions the media as an important source of information to facilitate observational learning and increase self-efficacy to perform given behavior is what Bandura has proposed. He also observed the social cognitive theories provide a rational viewpoint to analyze the impact of mediated content on audience attitudes and behaviors. Furthering the above explication, audience is required to be attentive and attracted to models with relevant behavior for any mediated content to influence their behavior. Such models indulging in positive behaviors should be positively reinforced, and those engaging in negative behaviors should be negatively reinforced. As an extension, it will bring about more positive changes on personal and social fronts when mediated content is aligned positively. At the same time, if the mediated content is aligned adversely, it can have adverse effect on personal and social fronts, negatively creating problems. The theory still suffers from the lack of empirical research in area of media influences, but with the growth phase media is in currently, it is an apt timing to draw up tests for predictions. Once the predictions are supported empirically, people can provide appropriate interventions. It could also be important to modify predictions to consider non-common media contexts, which would be critical information to uncover. It will undoubtedly be a pioneering theory to understand media effects on behavioral learning. Media research will only benefit from theory and nuances involved in developing it. The second thing that we need to understand the impact of social cognitive theory is on education. Education students is all about conditioning. It is inefficient in classroom to exhibit the ideas. But the environment outside classroom eventually challenges these ideas. It is in these real life situations where the ideas need to take shape, and for that it is pertinent that teachers adapt means of assisting students with building their self-efficacy. Teachers should force themselves to disseminate these ideas to students in a way that they can identify and develop different cognitive abilities. It will help root the ideas better among students if teachers tend to explain themselves as models and also take on challenges of explaining their behavior against ones modeled in media. The steps we have discussed so far would go a long way in establishing a powerful environment around students to enable them in honing the skills to handle real life better. Self-efficacy development would prove to be a great enabler for individuals for its real life applications and will last a whole life and not only keep growing alongside. As Bandura said, and I quote, "You cannot prevent the birds of worry and care from flying over your head, but you can stop them from building a nest in your hair," unquote. Like all the theories, this particular theory was also mired in a lot of criticism and controversies, which we need to look into so as to understand it better. The first criticism came from its dynamism. It says, given the dynamic and intricate structure of social cognitive theory, it is not easy to implement it in totality. As a result, the easiest aspect to implement self-efficacy is found to be entrenched in practice and does not stand out as a part of the theory in itself. The second criticism is about that the theory proposes that there is a dynamic interaction individual and its environment has, and as the situation changes, so does the behavior. However, it has been found that behavior tends to be more consistent and does not change that easily with changing situations in most of the situations. The third criticism talks about the preoccupation with only the cognitive abilities like modeling and expectation formation. It has overshadowed and underplayed the role of biological or hormonal determinants. It has been found that biological or hormonal processes too play a huge role in how people act and react respectively of their past experiences. These factors find no place in this theory, which you will also understand because you know that there are times when for no reason you feel sad or happy. So that means there are hormones are in play which have no direct connection with how you have learned in a particular situation. And the last criticism talks about that social cognitive theory ignores the inherent factors which too shape the personality of an individual. People with learning abilities may not be good at observing and modeling others, or certain people would have better learning skills right from the beginning. But these factors don't find a mention in the theory. Before we sum up this module on social cognitive theory, let's again have a brief summary of what we have learned so far. First is that, of course, Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory is one of the most insightful theories of human development. What makes it distinct is that from its inception to its final culmination, it has evolved many a time like any other psychological theory. Unlike any other psychological theory, Bandura proposed that humans are not just products of conditioning, but they also learn vicariously and evolve throughout their lifespan, thus suggesting that learning is a dynamic process, contrary to popular perception that what you learn once is what remains with you forever. The key aspects of this theory are human agency, human capabilities, vicarious learning, and self-efficacy, each of them highlighting how these can be used for human development and human growth in a positive manner. It also has a role in the area of media studies and education, and is vast and worth exploring into because so far the role of social cognitive theory has not been researched upon in these particular fields. Also, due to its dynamism and evolving nature, it has a lot of potential and a few lacunas in understanding human development and growth as an individual. It has been proven by various studies and gathered evidence that the relevance of social cognitive theory is valid for human development and deserves greater focus. And you, as aspiring psychologists and practitioners of psychology, have a huge role to play in taking it up to a newer heights.